Alright, we've got one hell of a score to settle, and it's time we finally put this to rest. But first we've got this close-knit group of enemies to deal with. They're pretty close together and in a very enclosed space, so the stage lets you know right away that it's not fooling around. It pulls pretty much everything that we've seen so far together. And as a result, boy did I sure die here a lot, but we're going to ignore that the best we can. On another note, it did seem that we finally managed to get some answers to our questions. It turns out that thing we destroyed last time was pretty important, as it stopped Ogre from escaping to the outside world. And with that, we also learned the importance of the ruins, which was to keep Ogre captive. Maybe we shouldn't have been running around just punching everything. However, Ogre did stop because he wanted to take care of us first, which may be a good thing, but it may also be a very bad thing. Ogre wasn't exactly a problem for us before, but we have no idea what he could have up his sleeve. Though again, it's not exactly like Jin cares, he just wants to get this done, period. Though even if he did care, it's not like we can call for help, all we've got is ourselves and our fists and feet. This is our fight, and whether we live or die is only for us to worry about. The stage is noticeably less labyrinthine this time around, but there's still plenty of jumping to speak of. There's also quite a few less secret areas, but neither of those things stop it from being pretty dang difficult overall. The environments are also still pretty interesting to traverse, so that's very appreciated. I also think this place is the most visually interesting location artistically. I mean, looking at it on its own, it may not seem like much, but we went through a lot to get here, and so did the game design. It's kind of a wonder that Jin's fists aren't bleeding profusely right now. Perhaps that's one of very few upsides to having a literal devil living inside of you. I think it's worth mentioning again that this game is pretty much just as much platformer as it is beat 'em up at this point. The game really evolved along the course of its, well, self. This area should look a little bit familiar. We have two different places to go, and if the previous stage has taught us anything, it's that both paths will be important. We're going to head left first, just like last time, if only for the sake of tradition. Something I haven't touched on yet quite as much as I feel I should have is that the enemy AI in this game is pretty great. Now I've said that before, but usually in games with large numbers of enemies, the AI is kind of dumbed down to make it possible for the player to, well, succeed at all. But in this game, you're given such a versatile moveset that it's possible for the AI to actually be rather intelligent and aggressive. Now again, it's not exactly God Hand, but all things considered, it's pretty well thought out. Giving players appropriate measures to deal with large numbers of enemies is the easiest way to ensure that your game's AI can be, well, aggressive. In this game, those appropriate measures are the sheer number of options you have in combat. It's hard to get a real feel by just watching, but there are a whole lot of moves at your disposal. Now, not quite as many as in a main Tekken game per se, but for a beat 'em up, yeah, there's quite a bit to do here. And the more you fight, the more you learn. You learn which moves are power moves capable of knocking enemies back, you learn how useful throws are, and at the end of the game, it just feels good to control Jin, period. Now obviously, there's no true way for you to feel one-to-one with the character you're controlling. Now, having said that, the game as a whole feels very natural, as if you're solving puzzles with your fists. There are those who consider single-player action games to be puzzle games, and I think that thinking of them in this way helps to dissect the game mechanics, so to speak. Now, this obviously isn't a puzzle game. There are many differences, such as the increased freedom of movement, but thinking of it as a puzzle game can help shed some light on the combat mechanics. I could have probably picked a better stage to talk about this because I get my ass absolutely handed to me, but what's done is done. And please do trust me when I say that things could be going much, much worse. In case you haven't noticed, we never seem to stop descending as we play this game. We only go down, down, and further down. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that this is probably the most interesting room we're going to see for the rest of the game. It has very few enemies to boot. It's worth noting that in the first couple of stages you could almost see that there were rules to the architecture, like there were certain things that the rooms would and would not do. But as the game progressed, that became less and less apparent. Now, the environments never exactly get wacky or anything, but they're still less predictable than they used to be. Man, we absolutely wrecked those guys. This room puts together all the mechanics of the block puzzles we've seen thus far, what few there are anyway. And of course, as always, it uses them in conjunction with platforming and the more labyrinthine aspects of the environment that we just discussed. Now again, this may not seem like much on its own, but knowing that we built up to this makes it a whole lot more meaningful and satisfying. The blocks have varied and sometimes strict time limits, the platforming is straightforward and slightly nuanced by interaction through the blocks, and of course, there's logic involved in solving the puzzle itself. In other words, this room manages to perfectly encapsulate the game's puzzle-solving mechanics, however simple they are. And we're right back to bashing on enemies. Or them bashing on us, rather, which seems to be the common theme for this stage. Now, I'm sure you know what this giant thing means by now. It means we're on our way to unlocking the boss door. Of course, I'm sure it's not going to be that simple. After all, the previous stage had 2 of them, who's to say this one couldn't have 3 or more? To preserve this mystery, I ask that you do not look at the video's length. Do not take advantage of the fact that I'm presenting non-linear media in a linear format. That would just be very rude of you. That being said, even without the aid of external time travel, we can probably guess that we're getting near Ogre. After all, we have been chasing him down for what must be the most stressful day of Jin's life. So far, anyway, I'm not even going to pretend that he won't have to do something way more horrible immediately after this is over. But hey, Jin can only have so many demons in his past, right? Eventually he's gotta run out. I couldn't tell you why I was so nervous about walking on this platform here. I've done it many times previously. I suppose you could say there's nothing directly stopping Jin from just chilling out and having a good time after all this horrifying stuff is over, but he's not that kind of person. He doesn't just sit still. You may have noticed that we're back in the room with the branching paths, and the boss door is still shut, which means we have somewhere else to go. Man, I really like this music. Up in here we've got a save point, which I'm going to ignore, and we have a rather tricky jump. At least, tricky for what this game has presented so far. But again, Jin controls exceptionally well in the air, so it's not an issue. The ruins and its guardians do not seem to be any less mad at us, especially now that we destroyed what was keeping Ogre here. Though I'm certain if we didn't take these guys out, Ogre would just do it himself. It is a little defeating that in the end we really have the same goal as these enemies, but it's not exactly like we can reason with them. That was pretty embarrassing right there. That last puzzle room we were in was the most interesting room to look at, but this room probably has the most interesting puzzle. It's the second and final multi-sword puzzle in the game. We did need to destroy those pillars, by the way, as always. But of course no room, puzzle or no puzzle, is complete without enemies to fight. I do like that the game, in addition to having a varied moveset, uses a combination of puzzle-solving, platforming, and combat to keep the game varied in general. As I keep saying, it's very simple design, but there is a lot of design here, and I do think it's worthwhile. I still haven't gotten over the way they teleport in, like they just rolled in from the sides right there, and that's pretty great. It just adds a bit of goofy style, you know? I'm definitely not wanting those enemies to fall down the pit like that, because we're gonna need that pit. Of course, the fact that they keep falling down does make the room less difficult, which can be appreciated on its own. It is worth noting, I find, that the combat still hasn't gotten old in spite of its simplicity. It's just really, really satisfying to hit enemies. Alright, now that that's over, we can focus on the puzzle, and in contrast to most, this one is entirely logic-focused. The main concern with this one is the blocks themselves, and you don't really have to worry about any platforming or external distractions. You simply need to find out which block lasts the longest without disappearing, and then where the other block needs to go to get onto the switch. Obviously, this looks very simple in practice, but it does take quite a while to figure out the first time through. And that was the last block puzzle in the game, and with the block puzzles entirely gone from the game, you can see that they were pretty simple, but they were also fairly well designed. Now, I'm certain that you've seen puzzles like that before, but the way they were built up in complexity along with the other mechanics of the game deserves recognition. Speaking of the game design, you can kinda see that I fell right into a trap here and got myself stuck in a corner, but we got ourselves back out. And right up here is probably my favorite jump in the game. Whoop. You might have noticed that we almost always greet enemies in the hallways with our high kick, and this plays directly into what I was talking about with choosing the appropriate moves for each situation. As always though, no matter what you decide, you have to act fast. And as promised, the enemies seem much less like normal enemies now, and more like hurdles to be overcome. Or, you know, we could just get our face kicked into the ground. That seems to happen quite a lot. Much less so when we can shoot lasers out of our eyes. Now in this room we can see something purple behind the caged-off platform over there. This is also, however, the hardest room in the entire stage for me. Not because of the platforming, however, although this is the last we'll see of platforming for pretty much the entire game. It's pretty much a guarantee that that guy will tackle you as soon as you land. I have not yet been able to avoid that outcome. The enemies in this room are the most aggressive in the entire game, and they also appear on relatively small platforms with nowhere for you to hide. This right here is also the last we're going to see of the platform pendulum, and just like every other one, we need to give it a quick boost before we can use it. We're saying goodbye to an awful lot of mechanics right now, which means that we're getting pretty close to our ultimate goal. Of course, it does help if we're facing the right direction. At least now we get to ride the last pendulum slightly longer than usual. And of course our old friend the crumbling platforms, who we're not going to see again either. Of course, you can see why this area would also be pretty difficult, consisting entirely of large enemies, but we do thankfully have a pit right behind us, and it's possible to play smart. I suppose the entire room is kind of a large pit, but that's neither here nor there. The point is we can put it to use. That's probably the best this has ever gone for me. We just broke the second and hopefully last glowing purple thingy, but we don't really have any time to celebrate. This is the most closed-in room in the entire stage, being completely surrounded by walls, and enemies keep spawning in constantly. Of course, we don't want to get too close to any of the walls or we'll get trapped in a corner like I just did. There really is nowhere to catch your breath right here, and you have to keep fighting non-stop. That's probably the best that transformation has ever felt. That certainly could have gone a lot better, but at least we survived it all, which is better than I can say for most of the time. And now here we are for the last time. The gate is open, Ogre is ready, and we've got one hell of a score to settle. Alright, here we go. He's been a scar in our life for too long, and it's time we face him down for good. We're more than ready for him this time, no matter what he throws at us. Though, what he's throwing at us honestly isn't much that we haven't seen before. I mean, he's obviously still trying to kill us, but this can't be all that he brings to the party. I mean, presumably he hates us just as much as we hate him. From what little we know about Ogre, he's only capable of hatred, rage, and violence. He should be putting up a better fight than this. I mean, we have him here like a cornered animal, and you know what they say about those. Not that I'm complaining this is going so well, but I can't help but be skeptical. This just really seems too easy. I suppose we're gonna find out soon enough. Well, this is a pretty horrible mess we've gotten ourselves into. This thing right here is called Monstrous Ogre, and it's capable of all the things Ogre was capable of, and much more, obviously. The most important thing here is a good balance of offense and defense. Most of his melee attacks can be blocked, but obviously when he tries to sit on us like that, it's not a good idea to just stand there and parry. Monstrous Ogre is also, of course, the most aggressive enemy in the game, and never really stops attacking. There are very, very few opportunities for you to attack, and you also have to keep in mind which attacks you can't block yourself. He has a pretty fair mix of both melee and long-range attacks, which means there's no room for complacency. His most dangerous attacks are the ones that leave you vulnerable for him to attack you again, because you can and will get stun-locked. Especially by his tail. Gen does take about a fraction of a second to block, so your best resort is to block first, and if it's an unblockable attack, quickly move out of the way. Trying to dodge as a first resort never works out well. Thank you all very much for coming with me on this strange little mini-game, if you want to call it that. This thing, as I've said countless times, is very simple as a whole, but the game design is there, and that's the most important thing.